Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Muslim Talks. I'm your host, Gary LaRock. Trump and Jerusalem. Well, this big incident. So we'll get into that in a minute. But first, if you go to patreon.com/Gary LaRock, you can support us, help us to continue to grow and to improve the quality of our work. And inshallah, continue, God willing, to give you the news and politics and potentially other entertaining videos and so on, from a Muslim perspective, and that's the goal. So patreon.com/Gary LaRock. Now, one of the big things that comes about this incident, unfortunately today protests have begun, and people are upset for obvious reasons. I mean, because part of the problem that we have here is that there's this position that some people falsely have, that the United States in any way, shape, or form has the authority to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Now, if we go back and look at history of Israel, in terms of Jerusalem specifically, now, I was looking at, there's just interesting information that you can go and you see that over the last 4,000 years, the tribe of Judah, the Jewish community, has only been in control of the city of Jerusalem itself for about maybe 500 years. Christians about around the same, during the Crusades and so on. The Byzantine Empire and so on. There was a point for about 500 years. Now, 1,000 to maybe 1,200 or to 1,500 in that range were pagan tribes throughout history that have controlled the area, and Muslims, again, about 1,000 to 1,200, 1,500 in that range as well. And it's only been this last, at least because in our lifetime, this has been going on. But so it's interesting to see that there's this claim of this land, and they were never the original owners of the land to begin with. So that, to me, that puts in using such an argument that, well, we had the land, 2,000 years ago, so we should get it back. Well, sorry, that's not a valid argument, right? Really what happened, the reason we have this issue today is because you had a group that was trying to control it. They basically stole the land from the Ottoman Empire. That's England, Britain, stole the land after World War I, controlled the land for a period of time, and then they realized most likely that it was too much of a headache to deal with, and there wasn't really any value to the land from their perspective. Of course, there was the religious significance of Jerusalem. So they carved it up, particularly after World War II, and in 1947, a plan was passed in which the country of Palestine, the region of Palestine, was divided up, and part of it was called Israel, and the other part was Palestine. Now, since that moment, even prior to that moment, there's been issues. Part of the struggle that the British Empire had at that time was the Jewish terrorists who used to bomb. There was an incident where they bombed a government building and so on. And which is kind of funny, because if you think about it in this day and age, imagine a terrorist comes in and blows up a government building in a country. So rather than hold those people accountable, they decide, here, you guys can have it. Yes, you blew us up, and yes, you destroyed, and killed people, but we're going to give the authority of this land to you, the terrorists. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Now, so in 1947, the United Nations had decided, just because of the significance of Jerusalem, because it's got three holy, the three major holy sites for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in this area. They said, well, let's give portion to the Jews, and you give portion to the Arabs, and then Jerusalem itself, because of that significance and because of the nature and the turmoil that can come from this, we're going to make it a neutral city, and it's going to be administered internationally, which means the authority of that land basically fell under the United Nations. Now, to me, I mean, it's a joke anyway. The United Nations is just it's a ridiculous concept. It has no authority whatsoever, right, at any given time. And we'll see through this quick conversation how it really is just, it may have at points in times have served a valid purpose, but in reality, it's just a framework of control for people, and it just serves to harm people because of the inconsistency. Now, so as we said, 1947, Jerusalem was a internationally administered city, neutral ground, kind of like you could almost kind of say in similar in essence, it's kind of like Rome, where Rome, sure, it's part of Italy, but it's its own little kind of independent state, if you will. Now, in 1950, the Knesset, which is the legislative body of the Israeli government, they had passed a resolution declaring that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. Now, they had no authority to do this, just as Trump has no authority to do this now. But they're going to do it anyway, right? Because they hold all the guns, right? That's what it really comes down to. Who has the power? They're getting away with it. They're doing what they want, and they're getting away with it. Now, the Knesset just passed this law, and it was condemned, right? The United Nations condemned this. You have no authority to do this. You have no right to do this, but they did it anyway, right? But it was kind of like behind the scenes, and nothing really came about. Now, if we fast forward, I mean, obviously there's always been conflict and things going on, but if we fast forward to 1967, Israel attacked Egypt, what's known as the 6-Day War. There was claims of this, but the facts are that Israel they're calling it a preemptive strike. The reality is that they arbitrarily attacked Egypt and claimed initially that Egypt attacked them, so they lied about it. But it didn't. It served the purpose at the time, and there was a whole bunch of incidents and controversial issues with this 6-Day War. But during that process, they occupied and annexed the East Jerusalem. Now, part of the problem with that was that, again, they had no authority to do this. They just did it. Because, I mean, if you think the long game, right, this is what we're doing here. The long game was to, this is what it's all been about, is how do we get all of the land and get Jerusalem and have control of it all. And that's what they're slowing. You can look at historical maps of the way Palestine was before 1947, and you can see how it's slowly changing, and the Arab Palestinian communities are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and Israel's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're taking up more stuff. So that was 1967. Now, in 1980, again, the Knesset passed the Jerusalem Law. This is what it's referred to. And they declared the capital, again, Jerusalem. So this was more of an official thing. So the previous one was more of a motion or a resolution, where this one is said, no, this is going to make a law. This is our capital, because they had a portion of it, and but they have pretty much had control over it. Even though on a map we look at, you say that there's a Palestinian Authority that's doing the West Bank and West Jerusalem and so on, but the reality is they have no power. Not really. Israel can shut them down, turn off the power, do it. Whatever Israel wants to do is what they'll do. Now, an interesting thing at that time is in 1980, the UN had passed a resolution. Again, we use this word resolution, but the resolution is that it really means nothing, because they don't do anything to enforce it. It's just wave the finger, you're bad, you're not allowed. So they had a vote. 14 people voted in favor of the UN resolution declaring that what Israel is doing is illegal. It's against, right? You cannot take Jerusalem. It's illegal. The weird thing is, if you think technically, by Israel doing this, they invaded the United Nations. Can you imagine somebody coming in and invading Rome, right? And like parts of Italy? There would be a world outcry. No one would tolerate this. But the interesting thing is that pretty much the world said no. The 14 countries that voted said no. This is, we're going to support the UN resolution against Israel, but one country abstained. Can you figure out who that is? Do I have to say it? Yes, the United States. Now, if we fast forward, we go to, again, I believe is in 1995. Again, we go through this, this process, and the Israel again has kind of gotten support. But in this case, in 1995, the United States has officially declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel. So this big announcement by Trump is really not a big deal. No, it's really not a big deal. I honestly think it's just a big distraction to get the world all, something else is going on, and they want us to focus on this Israel thing. I do have another theory, which I'll talk about in a moment, but that's kind of a quick rundown of Jerusalem over the last 4,000 years, but it's particularly the whole the legalities of it, right? You have an organization like the United Nations claiming to be in a position of authority to administer that land, and one of its members, Israel, comes in and violates that administration, takes the land, and claims it for themselves. Now, why is Israel even still a member of the United Nations? Because the United Nations is powerless. It's just a useless organization that has no power to do anything. It's just something that makes the world feel like we're connected. But the reality is everybody's there at the table with their own representation for themselves. The United States has veto powers on many things, which it doesn't deserve. It has no right to. And that's what we're talking about here. So Trump, with no authority and no right, the United States has to get out of everybody's business and stop doing these types of things because they have no, like, who cares? So Trump said it, big deal. What legal authority, what legal right does the United States have to make this decision? Now, my personal theory is that this is all about Trump's ego, right? Because the fact is, as I said, that the United States has officially declared Jerusalem the capital decades ago. They just knew from a political standpoint to not transfer the building because you don't have to. This is just a symbolic thing. It has no meaning. You can put your embassy wherever you want. It's just, it doesn't have to be in the capital. They just want it there, right? So politically, people have said, you know what? It's more headache than it's worth. It's just going to create problems. It's going to create a mess. People are going to get hurt. People are going to get emotional. It's going to create too many headaches. So let's not bother. So they sign this waiver, I believe, every 6 months or so to say, look, we're going to move it eventually, but now's not a good time. So that's basically what they're doing. They're being political about it. Now, Trump is not a politician. He's just a rich kid who was born with a privileged, silver, golden, diamond studded, whatever spoon in his mouth. And this is the way he grew up. He just does what he wants and he gets away with it. And that's it. So now he's just, it's all about his ego. He has become the leader of the most powerful country in history. And he's like, you know what? Things have not been good for me this year. I'm not getting anywhere. I'm not, there are all these roadblocks and I'm not getting what I want. So you know what? I'm going to just do something that I can actually do. And I don't care the impact. I don't care how many people are hurt. I don't care how many people suffer. I don't care that I even have the authority to do this. I'm going to do it. So Trump signs his name and gets to walk away. Why? Because he doesn't care, right? At the end of the day, even if he doesn't go for a second term, even if he's impeached, he gets to say, for a time, I was the most powerful man in the world. And he gets to stroke his ego and be happy. That's my theory, right? Because the guy is not a politician. He just does not care. The way he tweets, the way he behaves, the way he talks, it's just about him having the spotlight, having people pat him on the back, saying, you did a good job. Maybe he was overly nursed as a child. I don't know. But that's just my ideas. But so anyway, now, so I've had the fun part. Now, as a community, as Muslims, and for anyone else who feels passionate about these types of things, we have to be very, very careful, and we have to not allow our emotions to take over. Because on the surface, yes, I'm trying to present. This is how I deal with my stress and my anxiety. I try to be a bit humorous, and I try to just, I have to talk about things, and this is my way because I don't have the financial means. And actually, that's an interesting thing I wanted to point out as well, is that because I don't have the financial means, and I'm really apprehensive about donating financially to Palestine anyway, and not because I don't want to help, but because there's this process known as, there was a report that was done, I think started in 2001, and was released, I think, in 2014, called Squandered Aid, and this was by the UN, and basically it was talking about how, and it was specifically focused on Israel, where they donate money to help, after Israel invades Gaza and the West Bank. And the reason I think they don't destroy the West Bank and so much is because, there's just Jerusalem's part of that. And, it's a bigger issue, right? They don't want to, ruin their own stuff because they have plans for the West Bank. But Gaza, they can let's just mow it down and do what we want with it. That's the way they perceive it. I mean, That's the way it's presented. So the United States has been giving billions of dollars. I think under Bush, I think it was about $24 billion over a certain period of time that Israel was given. So Obama came in and gave them even more. So I think it's about on average about $3.5 billion until they hit $38 billion. And then once that's finished, the next president, whoever's in at that time, will extend it and most likely increase it. And they give this to Israel for military spending. Now, in contrast, in 2030, I had a hard time. It's really difficult to find the numbers. And there's people out there who are into statistics and this type of stuff, so they'll be able to provide more information. But I think it was about 213 million that were given to Palestine by the United States government. Now, in 2008, 2009, there was what they call, one of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? But I mean, the whole thing has been conflict since day one. But they collected about, I think, 1.6 or maybe 1.8 billion for 2009, and about 1.6, 1.4 in 2010. And this was collected by the government. People like myself, people like you out there who donated. This didn't come from the United States government. This didn't come from anyone. So that gives you an idea that the money that goes to Palestine generally comes from people who see suffering and seeing harm and saying, look, I want to help you build a school. I want to help you build a university. I want you to rebuild the hospitals that Israel has destroyed. And because the reason this money came, and it was a spike at that time, because in 2008, 2009, so basically December and January, February, Israel invaded Gaza, caused billions of dollars in damage, specifically targeting hospitals and so schools and so on, the infrastructure. They basically wanted to just make the life of the Palestinians a living hell, destroying everything that they need to function as a society, killing thousands of people. And so the billions of dollars that were raised over the next 2 years was like a drop in it's just not even a drop in the ocean to replace what was been destroyed. Now, this squandered aid report is talking about how since 2001 till 2014, 150 UN and EU, European Union projects that have been placed in Palestine and Gaza and so on were deliberately targeted and destroyed by Israel. So the idea is that I think it was in 2014 they gave the example of they got about 120 million, I think about 60 million pounds, and out of the 120 million US, there was about 50 million of it that year. So 120 invested, 50 million was deliberately destroyed by another little kind of invasion of Israel. So this is what that report's about, to say, look, we build stuff and we're trying to help these people get back on their feet, and Israel just comes in and destroys it all. So we're just wasting our money. We're wasting our time. We're wasting our energy. And this gives that sense from our community, this it's that, like, what do you do? Right, when you have this type of policy where you have a country like Israel that's literally getting away with murder on a regular basis, and you have a country like the United States that the only reason Israel gets away with this is because of their support from the United States. Imagine if the United States said no. If that resolution from I believe it was 1980, I think I said, if the United States is rather abstaining, saying, you know what, Israel, enough is enough. We're going to support you. But if you continue with the path that you're going, we're not going to support you financially. We're not going to give you any more military aid, and so on. Now, one of the things I will point out real quickly is my understanding is that this military aid is it's a catch-22 in a sense, because it's just a business arrangement. So the United States gives billions of dollars to Israel with the deal that they would spend the money by buying American products, right? Which is a little bit messed up if you think about it. So this explains why the United States is in trillions of dollars of deficit, because they give money and they say, "But the economy's good." Yeah, well, it's going to literally blow up in your face. It's a ridiculous idea. Take money, but shop in my store. How do you make profit this way? Here's billions of dollars, and you spend the $1 billion. I didn't make any money, but of course, somebody makes trillions and trillions of dollars, while the rest of the American people are in debt. So anyway, the last little bit here before we finish up is getting back to the Prophet ﷺ. He told us to be patient. And I see what's going on in Palestine as a similar situation as the first 13 years of prophethood in Mecca, where the Prophet ﷺ and the companions had no power, they had no authority, they had no means to really fight back. If they fought back, they would have just been devastated. They didn't have an army, they didn't have any way to protect themselves. So people were being abused and being murdered, and the Prophet would come to them and say, look, please, be patient. Allah will reward you. I know it doesn't seem like it. I know you're going through hardship, but there will come a time. There will come a time when the Muslims will rise up and we will live in a just society and no one will be able to do this anymore. And I see that's what's going on in Palestine right now, right? Because I'm not trying to, all the way through this, I don't want anybody to mistake what I'm saying. I am totally supportive of the Palestinian people and their suffering, but I don't necessarily agree with the means in which they've taken, groups like Hamas and so on, that are the methods that they're using to try to liberate the Palestinian people. I mean, you still have to be smart. Sticks and stones and, throwing, this kind of stuff against tanks and stuff like that. I mean, it sends a message to the world. That's great for bringing awareness. But beyond that, be smart about how you approach things, right? If you don't blindly walk into a battle that you're going to lose just for the sake of losing it, unless there's a bigger strategic goal right behind the scenes. But it's unclear of this. People get emotional, they get angry, and they do stuff, and Palestinians get hurt, and they get killed, and they get worse and worse. Things get more and more crackdown. The rest of the world has to get involved. The Palestinian people are suffering, and the world has to do something about it. And this incident is just going to show, it's going to be another excuse for Israel to escalate and they arrest children. They've got thousands of children, underage children in prisons for throwing rocks and things like that. They're abused, they're tortured. This is what's going on in this country. And so from somebody like myself living here in the West who's sheltered, and I just get information, right? I want to be very clear here that I do not hold a position. When I study the Quran and I started to study the Hadith, people will like to manipulate and say that there's a clear, attitude of down with the Jews, right, from Islam, and that's not true at all. The Prophet was just very specific in terms of we were fighting against a tribe, and that tribe at that time, whether they were Quraysh, an Arab tribe, these were the nations of the time. The Quraysh was a nation, Bani Qurayza, a Jewish nation. Right? These were the tribes of the time. So that's why we have these references to know that the Prophet was fighting this particular tribe of Jews. There were other tribes that lived peacefully with the Muslims that had no problems. There were Muslims, there were Jews that accepted Islam and benefited and grew, and they lived within the society all the way up until, right, until now. I mean, there's always been Jews living in Palestine. I mean, I have stories of friends who their relatives, to this day, they're still alive. And they say, look, they know what it was like in Israel, Palestine, before Israel existed in our time. And they said they used to live fine and peacefully with their Jewish neighbors. It wasn't until Britain came in and started passing arbitrarily, cutting up the land and doing this, and allowed immigrants, which is kind of funny because you can segue into the whole modern argument that the Muslim migration into Europe is destroying Europe. Well, most of the Jews that came in and established these policies, the Zionist movement is a European-based superiority type movement, right? They believe that they're superior people and that they deserve special privileges. They're really not that far from the Nazis. They're just being a little bit more subtle in their, they're not building outright prison camps and killing and murdering, right? Like the Nazis did. But that's what you have, a particular group of people in power in Israel. And the reason I'm saying this is because according to Islam, we blame the people who commit the crimes. You don't blame everybody. So we as Muslims have to be very clear about this, and we have to take that nuance. And that's why I'm talking about this in terms of what the Prophet ﷺ did. Yes, there are incidents that look bad and are used for propaganda to make Muslims look bad and say that Muslims hate Jews. That is not the case. The references are to talk about nations and tribes. We are fighting against this Jewish tribe. We're not fighting against this Jewish tribe. We're fighting against this Arab tribe. We're not fighting against this Arab tribe. That's how they did it back then. And we have to understand history from the proper perspective, meaning we're talking 1400 years ago. There were attitudes and bitterness between certain communities. Today, think about what's been going on since the 40s, okay? Prior to that, so the plan during World War One, before World War One was even ended, Britain and France were already planning how to carve up the Middle East. So when the war ended, they carved it all up. And this is when things started to go bad. Colonization, just arbitrarily, we're going to divide up families and communities, and we're just going to draw imaginary lines wherever we want in the Middle East. And that's what they did. My ancestors. Yay. Right? Why should I be proud of this kind of stuff, right? So now, once this stuff happens, you steamrolls. What do you do? What do you say, right? Learn history, study history. Okay, to summarize, basically, as I said, I mean, I'm just kind of expressing some of my own personal thoughts and ideas. I'm trying to be as factual as possible. So any of the mistakes that I made, I mean, feel free to obviously challenge the ideas. But in terms of the history of Jerusalem, I mean, obviously it's a highly debated and controversial area because everybody wants to lay claim to it. I mean, if you consider Christianity and Islam, we still account for upwards of almost, I believe, 60% of the world's population. So you got 60% of the world's population that hold this land, this region to be an extremely important part of their belief, right? Now, the issue is that we have 3 different locations. Now, it's a little tricky with the Jewish holy sites and the Muslim holy sites because they're in the same place, right? Whereas I think the Christian ones are a little bit off. So, but you know what I mean? At least so that was an interesting thing in the past. The way they did it, when the way they approached it was they gave access to one part for the Jews, one part for the Muslims, and the Christians have their area. And it's being fair. Let's just be fair about it. Right? This is not about being able to pray in these places, and for us as Muslims going to Al-Aqsa, and to be able to see the Dome of the Rock, this great historical building that's been around for centuries. I mean, this is a huge thing. It's supposed to be a very spiritual experience, but to get so emotionally attached, like as much as I hate it, if I never get to see Aqsa in my lifetime, it would be one of my regrets, put it on my bucket list. I would love to go there. It's at the top of my list. Alhamdulillah, I've been able to go to Mecca, and I've been able to go to Medina, and the 3 holy places for us as Muslims. Al-Aqsa is the last one, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives me that opportunity. But at the same time, I'm not, if I have to create conflict to go and pray in this site, the praying there is not worth it to me, right? And a lot of Muslims may argue this, but the fact is that there has to come a point in time when we as Muslims have to just step back and say, well, you know what? We can be angry, and we can be you just upset and infuriated at what they're doing, and that's the way I feel. I hate the fact that I can't just go. There's so many places in the world I can just go on a plane and just go to another country. I don't even need a visa or nothing, and I can just. This is the beauty of the tolerance and the peace of communities. I can walk in and I can experience their culture and their society, and it's amazing. It's an amazing experience. I can just walk in, right? But when it comes to Israel, someone like me, Muslim convert, I end up in a cell for weeks. They won't let me into the country. Like, it's just there's this bigotry and this hatred that has developed over the last 70 years since all of this come. And so I cannot blame the Arabs for hating the Jews, right? This is what they live in day out. And it becomes difficult from a psychological standpoint. It becomes difficult for people to separate between the good guys and the bad guys when you're constantly subjected to the ignorance out there that happens. I mean, you have some people that as I said, there's some Jews that really truly believe in peace and honesty and sincerity, and they want to build a community for everyone. And they have their belief, and they, just like me, want to be able to practice their belief. But then you have the other people. And unfortunately, the other people are the ones that tend to be in power and tend to make the decisions. And they ruin it for everyone else. And people die and people suffer. So why don't I support Israel? This is just the door to many, many examples as to why I do not support the state of Israel. I don't really care if it's Israel. You can call it Palestine. You can call it Bobsville. Call it Garysville. Then I'll be happy, right? The reason being I'm saying this is because I'm not a nationalist. I think the name and these fights and these arguments that people have over the name of a piece of land are irrelevant. If people are suffering, people are dying, people are being mistreated, the world has to stand up and say enough is enough. It's happening in Burma, it's happening in Syria, it's happening in Yemen, it's happening in Africa in terms of like Sudan and South Sudan and Central African Republic, the Congo, you name it, right? And whether we want to admit it or not, this is a direct result of how we, the white European culture and society, has gone into countries and devastated lands and taken what we wanted. And then when mess gets too bad, we just run away and go back and leave it to them. And then we look at them saying, look at those people, how messed up they are. Right? This is the attitude. But anyway, just to start. So please do not mistake my intention here. I'm not a pacifist, and I'm not an individual who takes things lightly. I do think that Trump's statement is ridiculous, but at the same time, I think that we as a community need not focus on it so much, because as I tried to establish at the beginning of this podcast, that this has been going on anyway. It was declared at the Capitol decades and decades ago. They just didn't make the formal step. So don't let them use this as a tool against us. Deal with it properly. Use your voice. Speak out. But as soon as you turn to violence and aggression, they win. They have us trapped, and it just feeds the narrative that Muslims see the terrorists. It's just a building. It's an embassy, and you're doing this. So I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps us safe, helps us to protect us all, and inshallah we'll be back with more. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.